Well, welcome back to the Heidegger and Classical Thought reading group. I'm going to hand straight over to Lawrence for today's introduction. Lawrence.
Okay, I don't promise to hold to the 7 minutes, but although I may not, but I did get the chair's permission before breaking the rule, despite the fact that he's denying it, and unfortunately, I didn't record him saying yes. I wanted we didn't reach section 48 last week, and I wanted to therefore go through section 48 and to return us, but really it means returning to the beginning of section 45 just for a momentary recapitulation, because it strikes me that these sections 45 to 49, so as Aaron said, we're probably not going to touch section 50 this week, form a very important unity. And they form an important unity particularly for this reading group, because we are, as the Heidegger and Classics reading group, the reason why we selected this text in the first place, apart from its huge importance in the Heidegger oeuvre, as it were, we feel that it has particular importance for the interpretation, especially of Parmenides and Heraclitus. Not so much that there is a stated interpretation in each case, although today, as you know, there are several fragments where Heidegger investigates quite closely of Heraclitus. But rather, this is one of the first places, in fact, I can't think of anywhere earlier, where Heidegger lays out with enormous clarity what becomes the fundamental basis of his classical, if you like, if you wanted to call it the classical interpretation, or the interpretation of the classics, that then continues actually indefinitely. And that is the fundamental move that he makes. And he makes this in discussion with people like Karl Reinhardt, who was a personal friend of his. Without doubt, he must have discussed it with people like Kurt Rietzler, with Julius Stenzel, and with others. That instead of interpreting Heraclitus and Parmenides as standing in opposition to each other, that they stand, as it were, on the same ground. That the way to understand what we've come to call the pre-Socratics, although Heidegger attacks the idea of them being called the pre-Socratics, because he doesn't want to single them out as in some way, or to single out the Socratic tradition as the predominant one, that they speak from out of the same ground. And so we see that right from the very beginning of section 445, where we have this positing of what we are looking for, which is the Vorherrschaft, the predominance of the question of the interpretation that is going to take us through these sections. I want to begin by making just one or two general observations that, as it were, are parallel to the text. The first is that within the text, there is a continuing meditation on the nature of the one. Now, sorry, I thought I'd turned off all the pings that happen on my phone. Classically, the unity of being is understood and interpreted through the unity of the mind of God in the metaphysical era, as it were. That is, in the period that postdates the decline of antiquity. And we must always remember that right from the beginning, in fact, Heidegger refers to it in a lecture as early as 1920, in the passage to Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, that he understands himself writing after Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, so that it is no longer possible to elucidate the unity of being through anything like a metaphysical concept of God. This doesn't mean that Heidegger doesn't believe, or even that he does believe in God, but it does mean that the way in which the understanding of God is used to drive the understanding of unity can no longer be understood to apply philosophically. The second thing that we touched upon last week in those sections 45 to 48 is this continual reference to the Abendland, to the West. Now, in my opinion, this has been a very difficult area to interpret in Heidegger's thought. We sort of take it for granted that when we speak of the Abendland, when we speak of the West, we in one sense include Greece within that. But I'm going to suggest to you that this is an impossible thought, that Heidegger did not understand the Abendland to be to include Greece. He understood that the Abendland inherits a tradition, that it represents the maintenance of a tradition. But in a lecture that was given in just a year after this one in Rome, one of the two lectures that he gave there were the two that Carl Levitt was bound up with, that the meeting with Carl Levitt took place actually before one of those lectures. Heidegger reminds people that Greece was formed out of a pressure, he says, he begins right at the beginning, the pressure of the Asiatic. Now, if we don't understand what he means by that, we could assume that this is some reference to, let's say, a Nazi ideology or some racist ideology of the Asiatic, as it were, as a pollution or an outside to Europe. It's nothing of the sort. The notion that Greece forms, as it were, by coming up against a pressure from the East, and that it develops itself, it develops its intellectual intuitions as a result of having to defend itself from an incursion from the East, is a thought certainly that's carried through the 18th and the 19th century in Germany, but it's carried through by the geographers and by thinkers like Burke and thinkers like Burckhardt as a way of trying to answer the question, why Greece is the origin. This is a question that besets classics at the present time, and that classics is often not able to answer. So that if we understand Greece as the origin, and therefore we understand that within the origin there is a movement, and there is a movement therefore into the East, and we know that Heidegger understood this movement because we know, for instance, he did a course in the developments in what was called at the time Arab philosophy, and therefore that means Muslim and Jewish philosophy as it was developed in Alexandria and in the Levant. And then neoclassicism moves, and it moves according to an understanding by people like Burckhardt and even Nietzsche into the West. It moves into the Germanic space so that the Germans become the holders of the tradition of neoclassicism. This is something we will have to return to when we come to the very political comments that are made in this lecture course later on. But it needs to be borne in mind, and it needs to be borne in mind that this is a thought that long predates, as it were, its polluted interpretation in National Socialism, but rather is an attempt to understand how the movement of neoclassicism itself unfolds in Europe overall. I mention these two things because I want you just to keep them in mind as we read through the developing argument in these sections 48, 49, and 50. We then move on, therefore, to a series of demolitions. I don't know if those, I hope many of you follow Slack, but let's just say the little excursus that we made last week into the question of the intellectual tradition, Aaron chased down to Heidegger's discussion around German idealism, which was the basic intuition of the reading group last week. We kind of rolled around a bit, and Richard Polk gently rebuked us for being too Hegelian, but we were along the right lines, as it were. What emerges in this is a critique of two traditions. The first is the idealist tradition in its formation, and the second is the logical tradition. That is to say, the positing of logic as the laws of thinking, which therefore resolve the relationship between being and thinking. So that returns us to the question of the relationship between das Sein and das Denken. And this is what drives these sections, 48, 49, and 50, as the explication of them all the way through. So that once we have, as it were, got out of the way the metaphysical tradition in its consequences, in its development, we're then able to bring metaphysics into view by ourselves moving into the province of Greek thought. And this is where the revolutionary move is made. And that is to say, the connection rather than the distinction between the thinking of Parmenides. He is the one who thinks toka autonoe in estin te ke ene, for this, a simple translation, for the same is for thinking as is for being. And the connection with that and with Heraclitus. So that the revolutionary move here is to read Heraclitus as if he stands on the same ground as Parmenides. That the possibility of that is posed right at the beginning. In section 45 and then all the way through, the question of the origin is constantly put before us. Now, I've tried to suggest in the weeks that we've been discussing this, that there is a sequence of argument, a taxis, as it were, going on in this whole text all the time. But here it becomes exhibited for the first time. We're going to look for what is ursprünglich, for what is most originary in each case. And so the question will be whether we are looking in the right way. You will recall the discussion in the text that we will come across as we go through it today, of the difference between Hegel and Hölderlin. Both, says Heidegger, speak from out of the same ground, but they are looking in opposite directions. Hegel looks backwards, Heidegger says. And to look backwards means to look at what is no longer present, das Abwesende. And what is the no longer present in this case? It must be the unity of all things in the mind of God. Because if Hegel's philosophy and Hegel's metaphysics represents anything at all, it is the last dramatic, almost monumental postulation of the thought of universal presence as the singularity of presence, as the mind of God, as the Geist Gottes, so that subjective spirit becoming absolute spirit is subjective spirit being absorbed almost pantheistically into the being of God. And rather, Heidegger points us towards Hölderlin, who looks forward. Now, here we have to keep in mind something that was said in 1924, that the fundamental determination of the thought of being is the future. Kojève misunderstood this thought. He thought that that meant that, as it were, only the future is what matters. The future constitutes the present. Heidegger speaks against that in actually a multitude of places, but especially in volume 21, but in other places as well. And he speaks against that constantly in this text by constantly drawing our attention back to the primacy of the presently present. And this is the last thing I want to say in introduction before we begin to look at the text. And I don't know how I'm doing for time. I can't see Aaron's face and whether he's frowning yet, but I'm probably over my 7 minutes. I've got a thumbs up, so I'm okay. Let me make a radical suggestion to you. It is impossible to understand the philosophy of or the thinking of Martin Heidegger unless you understand the meaning of the term das Seiende. We have become accustomed to thinking that thinking itself is a discursive activity. This word discursive, which is you find throughout the French thinkers, but Foucault especially, that is to say that there is no underlying reality. This is Nietzsche's thought, actually, that truth is the truth is that kind of error without which the human being cannot live. Life decides, he says, for this. Therefore, what is given for us to think is given purely in logos. This text, above all, destroys that thought. And it destroys that thought on two grounds. It destroys it first by saying that the primary meaning and understanding of logos is not speech, language, or the word. And it could not be made clearer in this text that we have to understand this in that way. And I would take some convincing that Heidegger ever changed his mind on that, even though he became preoccupied with questions of language in the 1950s. He becomes preoccupied with questions of language proceeding from the thought that the most originary thought of logos has nothing, as it were, to do with language, although this originary thought is what lets language speak in the way it does. But the second thought is the one that I began with. The meaning of das Seiende must be taken off from the notion of the gathered unity, which is itself constantly gathering. And therefore it cannot be thought in a plurality. It cannot be thought so that das Seiende as the presently present. We saw this in the discussion around Husserl and Wittgenstein. The presently present is that which leads. And so that which leads is the arche. And therefore the arche is the most originary, ursprünglich. All of these words connect up. But it is nevertheless that within which we live as that which leads, presents itself to us most originarily. And this is what we're looking for in each case in order to be able to think through what is going to be said today, that the most originary is a unity. And as a unity, and Heidegger makes this explicit in two places, it cannot therefore be concerned with, he says, a heap of things, i.e. we cannot translate das Seiende in the plural. And it cannot be concerned with a bunch of things shoved together. The Geschiebene, he says, which is literally the shovelings, the shoveled together, the aggregate, as it were, the aggregate in the sense that you go to a builder's merchant to buy a bag of aggregate to make cement, a heap of stones. But rather it is the gatheredness of gathered unity, which is constant, ständig, he says. And as constant, it neither has a past nor a future. Inasmuch as it has no future, we have to rule out Korzyb's interpretation of the discursive. And inasmuch as it has no past, we have to rule out Hegel's interpretation of the discursive, which leaves us only with, as he says, the thought of what poets and thinkers think, which is why he singles out Hölderlin, those ones who look forward, who are forward directed, but nevertheless forward directed to the most originary. And the most originary is the singularly gathered unity. If we keep these thoughts with us as we work through the text today, I would suggest to you the text will unfold. And what is a very demanding and very difficult text will unfold with great ease, actually with surprising ease. Now, what that will mean is that we have to take the translation that we've got, and it is a splendid translation. We saw that discussion, the discussion that we had with Richard and with Greg just recently. But we have, in several places, I think, to attend to it, to try to read back, to go into the German more than the English, to, as it were, see what the translation, which is rendering an average interpretation for a general audience, how for us, who are trying to be much more specific, trying to unlock the secrets of this text, or rather the secret, which is the gathered unifying unity of this text. we will have to address certain translation issues to let it reveal its secrets to us. So with that, I will shut up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. 7 minutes, eh?
That was only 7 minutes. Please talk longer.
It's interesting that you brought up neoclassicism as well, because this is, this is on my mind a lot at the moment, especially in regards to last week, where it became clear that we're talking, or Heidegger's talking about Schelling, Fichte, Hegel, German idealism. And what I've been thinking about this week, in particular, in relation to this text, and especially this notion of unity that's emerging in Heidegger here in relation to Heraclitus and the gathering of Logos, is that, well, neoclassicism, you've mentioned Burke and you mentioned Burckhardt and Nietzsche, who were all active in Burke in the beginning of, I suppose he went to Berlin in 1817. Burckhardt and Nietzsche are roughly contemporaries in the second half of the 19th century, but obviously neoclassicism goes back to the mid 18th century, arguably starts in 1756, when Winckelmann says, if we are to become almost as good as the Greeks, if we are to imitate, or if we are to become inimical, then we need to go beyond the Greeks. We need to imitate the Greeks and then go beyond them. And that sets this kind of gauntlet for post-Winckelmann neoclassicist German thinkers, especially people like Schiller and Goethe and Lessing, and even people like Hegel and Ranke, to really think through, well, how are we German and how do we differentiate ourselves from the Greeks themselves? And that is the basis of neoclassicism. So then you get to, and I don't want to drift away from the text, but then you get to Heidegger in the Nietzsche lectures, where he's talking about Nietzsche and Hölderlin. And it's a quote from Nietzsche where it says, it's an amusing comedy, which you're only now learning to laugh at, which we're now for the first time seeing, that the contemporaries of Herder, Winckelmann, Goethe, and Hegel claim to have rediscovered the classical ideal. So Heidegger says, well, it wasn't quite Nietzsche that was the first to make this claim, but it was Hölderlin. It was Hölderlin who saw through the humanism and the classicism of neoclassicism and what people like Goethe, Schiller and Lessing were doing. So it got me thinking, well, how are they then understanding unity themselves? How are they differentiating themselves from the Greeks? And then I came across this interesting passage from Schiller in 1790. If I can just find it, I've got it written down here. This is from 1793-94. And he says, I do not deny the advantages which the present race, considered as a unity, as an Einheit, and on the scale of reason, may claim over the best of the old world, of the ancients. But then he says, but what individual of the modern generation will step forth to contend man to man with the individual Athenian for the prize of humanity? So it's clear here there's an understanding of unity, of Einheit, that's going on with the Greeks that then extends through to Hegel as well, and to German idealism, which I presume is this historical consciousness, this unity of purpose, this teleological unity that they believe history is pushing them toward, which they think the Greeks lack. So to what extent then, to bring back to this text, is Heidegger here challenging that concept of unity with Heraclitus, especially because, of course, Hegel himself thought what he was doing was continuing Heraclitus's work in the sense of a philosophy of becoming, in a kind of dialectical process, I suppose, or progress. So is it an undoing of that as well? Is he saying, well, no, we've actually just completely misunderstood that the Greeks did have a sense of unity, and here it is?
The only possible answer can be in the second paragraph of section 48. He says, dabei halten wir fest. So herewith, this is what we hold fast to. Das Auseinandertreten von Sein und Denken muss, wenn es ein inneres, notwendiges ist. So the Auseinandertreten, the stepping apart, the stepping away from each other, the disjunction the translation has, of being and thinking. They have of between, but it's von. Wenn es ein inneres Notwendiges, if it's an inner and necessary distinction, now there is the breath that you can hear the haunting hint of medieval metaphysics, because the unity is an inner and necessary thing. But the inner and necessary unity, which we experience as a manifold, must therefore, that innerness and necessity is carried over into the disjunction. And then this comes, and this answers your question. Muss in einer ursprünglichen Zugehörigkeit des Geschiedenen gründen, must be founded on an original belonging of what is separated. Now, I put before us the notion of das Seiende, and I contrasted that to the discursive. And the discursive, by the way, is showing up in every way at the present time. Even ChatGPT is a mode of discursive discussion of reality. It takes an aggregate of all the different views that it can find of the reality concerning something or some aspect, and it aggregates them in such a way that this can be interrogated. This is a theory of presence. And I'm not being particularly revolutionary here. This is exactly what Lyotard described in La Condition Postmoderne in 1979. But what it does is it hides the inner unity, because ChatGPT is incapable of distinguishing between one important thing, which is which of those namings of the aggregate that really prevails. Now, you will remember that towards the end of section 48, this is one of the few places where I think that the Richard and Greg last week said that they very often wanted to try to use the prevailing language of Heidegger translation. And so they translate this little phrase, keeping all this firmly in view, we say being as physis is the emerging sway. And sway has become the way that we translate the verb walten, or the noun walten, the verbal noun walten in German. But the trouble is that we don't really use sway in ordinary language anymore. We don't say that John Rose holds sway over his computer when he controls it or when he directs it, nor do we say that Pete holds sway over the website being.com, although we know he's the one who is responsible for it. So emerging sway here must be really arche, the governing, the controlling, the directing, the thing that sets into order, not governing as a technocratic or technical means, but governing as that which comes to preeminence. So therefore, that keeping all this firmly in view, we say being as physis is what is essential. That's what it really says, as das Aufgehende Walten, as the emerging, because being is the constantly ständig, therefore the presencing, which is also emerging. But the constantly emerging is what rules, is what commands before anything else. This was the discussion that Natalia pointed us to a few weeks ago. We then go back to the beginning of section 48, and we go back to that we are looking for the thing that is, we are looking for how the disjunction for being and thinking is founded on an original belonging together of what is separated. But that original belonging together is both innig, and it is notwendig, it's necessary. And what is innig and notwendig is therefore what is walten, what is ruling, what holds sway, therefore. Well, you can have your sway at that point, but this is where we've actually had to exhibit what sway really means. It's what we cannot but get around. We cannot avoid this. Even when we try to avoid it, our very avoidance of it governs the avoidance. We can't duck it. We can't even put our hands over our eyes and assume that it's not there, because the act of putting our hand over our eyes discloses that it is there because we're trying to hide from it. And that's, I think, I hope, the answer to your question. Now, what that means is, therefore, that the real is not given in discourse. The real is simply given. You remember this phrase that troubles Derrida so much and troubles so many of the postmodern thinkers, es gibt sein. It's just there. That's all that says. Es gibt sein. It's just there. Es gibt Zeit. It's just there. Even Kant says this, although he says it in the most extraordinarily backhanded way. When he says that sein is not a real predicate, it's because being is already there. Das Seiende, the presently present, is already there. There's nothing we can add to its being already there. And so das Sein becomes an issue about what is what determines, as it were, what's at issue.
Can I ask a question? Lawrence, I think you were right about what's going on in this text. But I have to say that what's going on in this text is what sometimes makes me sympathetic to Derrida. But I wanted to trace it back to this logos thing. You're right. He says here that logos originally would not be speech. He wants to trace it to Legein and gathering. I wonder if maybe Aaron can say whether or not Heidegger is on any firm footing with that. Maybe he can come in on this after I'm done. But unless Heidegger has completely drifted from his earlier approach to things, it may be that he does want to point to something different from speech that is more originary, but it can't be other than speech, because in his original phenomenology, it says whatever is to be uncovered within what we do have access to. And so I think you're right. He's trying to bring out something that's more original from speech. But I would be very troubled if this is something utterly separable from speech. Aaron, is Heidegger on any firm footing with this Legein stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the two examples that he gives are fairly, I think, are fairly clear on that front. It does become, especially in the 18th and 19th century, logos does become simply reason, Vernunft. I think Andrew might know more about what's going on with what's going on in the 6th century and the 5th century in regards to logos, but these examples from Homer and Aristotle as well, they do point to an understanding of logos or Legein as gathering. But it does simply become, if I think of Thucydides, for example, it does simply become most of the time speech or thought is how it's generally translated. So that's how we generally think it through. But it comes up so often in these texts, through the historical text, the philosophical text of the 5th and 4th centuries, that it's difficult to say, well, you'd have to do a lot of work to see where this original meaning of Legein is still present, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, in Being in Time, he straight out says that logos has to do with discourse or reda, and reda is speaking together about the world. It's very specific about that. It's not reason, it's not principle, it is speaking together about the world. And I mean, you could say that implicit in all that is a gathering, and that Heidegger, as Lawrence is correct to say, seems to be reaching for something deeper than speech.
I think it's
But
new for Heidegger here. I think as we went through GA55 last year, which is the 1943-44 lectures on Heraclitus, and they did a lot of work on what was going on with Heidegger and the classical philologists at that time. And you do see a kind of development in Heidegger's thinking, especially as Hölderlin becomes more important for Heidegger from around 33, 34 onwards. And I think that's what tweaks. You get this really comprehensive analysis of Anaximander and Parmenides in 1932. But I don't think he's worked Heraclitus out then. It's not until after the Hölderlin lectures of 1934 that he really starts to think, well, how are we rethinking logos here? And he's not alone in that. Julius Stenzel was another one. Lots of the philologists were trying to rethink logos based on this repopularity of Hölderlin and Nietzsche from the 20s and from 1930 onwards. There was a real struggle to understand how language works. And I think Heidegger was just kind of riding the wave of that. He wasn't necessarily going against the grain on that, but he was really working with the philologists and other philosophers in this area to rethink the structure of language and how language works for us. I think Andrew was going to come in then.
All I was going to say is that his etymology, if you will, is standard. I mean, it's undisputed that the word originates in the notion of gathering, and that is the original meaning that then comes to have associated meanings, and perhaps in the end, and I'm not sure when, the meaning changes. It no longer means gathering, or it's no longer thought to mean gathering. I would say it's fairly late, though, that the notion of a selection is missing entirely. But I've never made a study of it, so I really can't speak to it.
I remember reading in Xenophon's Memorabilia, Xenophon is playing with dialectic, which is in Plato dialegestai, and he says, well, Socrates conceived of dialegestai as dialegein, which meant ungathering or tearing things apart, classifying them. So clearly Xenophon was very aware of this original meaning, but he being playful with it.
It's something that Aaron and I have uncovered several times, is that Heidegger is normally very cautious in advancing these arguments, partly because he was advancing them in discussion with other philologists. But exactly as you've said, Antoine, I don't think there's any doubt about the etymology in question here. And I was amused by the example from Aristotle, because it's devastating, actually. I mean, it's delicious. Because Aristotle would, of course, be the one person that one would turn to say, well, Aristotle doesn't know it as gathering. And there it is. And of course, Heidegger knows how to make a good argument. So, I mean, he's being crafty. And now, to go back to Larry's point, though, and the separation, as it were, that's being made is in order to disclose the unity. Now, this is where I alluded to the metaphysical tradition of thinking the one. Because where I think we have ended up, especially in the post-positivist and the postmodern discourse that we are used to, we are unfamiliar any longer with understanding the way in which differences also indicate belongings. But in fact, the passing of the thought of the one in the mind of God, in the Jewish and the Arab Islamic and in the Christian traditions, all require a way of accounting for the manifold, so that in each case one is trying, with the thought of the one must also demonstrate the being of the manifold. And what that means, therefore, is that in what are we doing when we separate out the understanding of logos from what it comes to mean in language. We are looking for what is most originary. And the reason we're looking for what is most originary is that then helps us to see how, when we speak of logos as language, and of discourse, of reason, however we want to, logos, as you know, has multiple translations, and that's why he even refers to the prologue of St. John's Gospel. It then becomes possible for us to see how that unity is carried out. In other words, in each case, and it's not accidental that he chooses that particular phrase from Aristotle, we're looking for the taxis, the proper order in which things are to be thought through. And that's what I think makes this text so revolutionary. That in it, all the way through it, there is a striving for order. It's also, and this is my just gentle tease at Larry, it's where it makes someone like Derrida's explanations impossible, because Derrida is a master in destroying order in order to throw everything up, to say that because you cannot find order here, there is no order to be found. In each case, Heidegger's proceeding in the opposite way. He's saying, unless we are able to think through the proper order in which these things stand, and not stand historically, but stand in the present. In other words, his point is that it's not because logos once meant something that we now have to qualify what it does mean now, but that logos still primarily and originarily is going on in the presently present, doing this unifyingly gatheredness that is the only thing possible that lets speaking speak. Now, this is to think, therefore, of Das Seiende not as thing or as things, or even as the unity of thinghood, but rather as the unity of presence. It's why I think that translating into English Das Seiende as anything related to being, I'm increasingly of the view that this is an impossible translation, because we hear in the presently present, or in the present, or in presence, the unity that we are required to hear, that we can't even hear when we say, as John Macquarie used to say when I went to his lectures 35 years ago, 40 years ago, being with a little b, as it were, which meant nothing. I can tell you now, we had no clue as undergraduates what he was on about. We couldn't see this distinction. It's why Heidegger, I think, was against it, the being with a little b and being with a big B. But it was John's, don't get me wrong, John Macquarie was a very dear man and a very, very serious scholar, and he was desperate for us to understand, and he worked very hard to get us to understand. But we didn't understand. We couldn't see it because it wasn't clarified. Now, what I find so dramatic about this text is the ways in which it brings to clarity those things which Heidegger in other texts often refers to as dunkel, as cloudy, as misty, as not clarified, but doesn't do the work in those texts because there isn't the time or it's not the appropriate place. But in this revolutionary text, he does that work before us, before our very eyes. We may not agree with it, and that's fair enough. We may, but nevertheless, my hope, at least today, is that we can at least appreciate the splendor of the work that's unfolded here before us.
Let me try just one more time. First of all, when we talk about logos as speech, that is different from logos as reason, and that difference is very important. But let me leave that aside. How would Heidegger's reaching for something unifying be different from metaphysics?
Surely, precisely. I mean, that because in the metaphysical tradition, the unity is always posited as an over there, as an epikeina. But in this case, the unity is the presently present. It's with us. He says at one point in the text, it's dabei. It's hereby, not, we want to translate that as thereby, as over there, but it's not. Da means here in this case. It's dabei, it's right with us.
I think that's the point I was trying to make with my initial question as well. That's how they were. Everybody, all the German thinkers, the poets, the philosophers, the historians, they're all trying to think through the Einheit as some unity that was over there that we need to, and through Kant, I suppose Kant is the one that made it possible to try and bring unity to mind, I guess.
Mhm.
If I may suggest, one of the problems I have found when I've tried to teach this myself with students is that the struggle they have is because the subject-object distinction is so ingrained into the modern mentality that we always presuppose that, as it were, we move from the subject into the unity, that the subject, as it were, somehow stands outside the unity of being. And the subject, this is a sort of a caricature Humean position. So the subject trots in to the unity of being, grabs the sensory perceptions that it needs, and then trots back out into its own interior space. Now, if we pop the subjectivity of the subject into the unity itself, so that the unity is prior even to our experience of selfhood, such that in the manifolding of the unity, in the breaking open of the unity into its manifold, the first thing that becomes available to us is the selfliness of the self, which then breaks the unity of what is presently present into its respective thinghoods and particularities. Then this is how the medievals thought of it. Then we begin to see how this unity works, that it always works as already having contained us, and from out of which the manifold is broken. Sorry, Doug, I interrupted you.
I was just going to back up a bit of what Larry was arguing earlier, that there's that logos cannot be completely distinguished here. And I'm just thinking of the 50s on the way to language, where Heidegger will have this idea of writing being colon sagen, saying, and it's not the saying of speech, but it's the saying of silence that being speaks. So he's still playing with this idea of how logos and this gathering is somehow connected with being.
I think that's right. I mean, I wouldn't want to disagree with either you or Larry. The only question that I would put is in what order these things stand. Which one stands first? If we want to distinguish, let's say, in logos, between logos as reason and logos as speech, what order do they stand? Or do they just sort of jostle along together? Well, the text repeatedly reminds us not to just throw them into a heap, but rather to look for the ways in which they stand in relation to each other.
Okay.
Now, in other texts, and again, it's not here, but I know Lasha Kharazi has been thinking about this. There is the question of the Schweigen, of the keeping silence.
Yeah.
That anticipates logos. But without that Schweigen, we saw this all the way through GA 55. Without that Schweigen, the speaking of logos is not able to do its utterance.
Exactly.
And we could we rewind and go back to Niemeyer 96, the paragraph that Lawrence, you were on, that starts with unter der Voraussetzung about Physis.
Yeah.
So I think this is puzzling. Das aufgehende Walten is supposed to mean die ständige Anwesenheit or die Ständigkeit. but we're talking about an Aufgehen. So I mean, I guess that if it was, I mean, and always thought that this was important for Heidegger, that Physis as Aufgehende walten, and not merely as walten. There is an emergence of the walten. And this emergence is a motion, it's a change. And he says, well, it is still ständige Anwesenheit. In the same breath, so to speak. And this is strange.
But it's only strange if we take das Aufgehende as a constancy, so that that Sein is always Aufgehende, as the ständig Aufgehende, the constantly emerging. I mean, I'm thinking of the way in which, that's why I named it, the way in which Kojève misinterpreted the looking forward to the future. Because he sees that, he actually says this in the lectures that Queneau, the text that Queneau produced of the lectures from the 1930s, that as it were, the future is what is primary. But Heidegger is very explicit about this in several places. It's not the future, but rather the futural. Now, the futural is that looking, that being directed, that he says Hölderlin achieved, Hölderlin accomplished. The being directed is towards the Vorkommende. And here, Vorkommende plays the same role as Aufgehende. The Vorkommende is the constantly forthcoming. Now, constantly forthcoming and Aufgehende, ständige Aufgehende, both say the same thing. They say Anwesen. And Anwesen is not presence, but presencing. So that when Heidegger does distinguish das Sein, das Seiende, as das Anwesende, that which has presence, from das Anwesen, that which is presencing, and yet they belong together, so that the presencing presence is the only way we can translate this. Then we get something of the order, I think, of das Aufgehende Walten. So that it's the constantly emerging ruling that is at issue. It's not an ein Aufgehende or das Aufgehende, but rather das Aufgehende Walten. The Aufgehende is descriptive of the Walten. It explains what the Walten, how the Walten is, that it is constant. Now that's how I read this, but you may disagree, I don't know.
Well, it seems that the idea of an emerging, or as you say, as a presencing, is not exactly the same as a standing presence or a constant presence.
Not if you're Plato. If you're Plato, constant presence as an epikener is elsewhere. But this is the question, isn't it, that Zeno addresses. So that Socrates mocks Zeno for, because he says, well, you say there is no motion. But what Zeno, it seems to me, is really saying is that only with the predisposition for something to be moved can there be motion. So that the being moved is prior to the motion. It's not that there is no motion, but that there has to be a constantly opening for motion to take place. This is the thing that Socrates refuses to accept. So that ständige Anwesenheit, constant presence, becomes an absolute stability of the forms. This is Aristotle's polemical attack on Plato, that the forms, as it were, must exist somewhere. They must be somewhere. And this, of course, is Aristotle's problem, that he doesn't want an epikener as such, but he does need an energeia. But even an energeia is the constant. How would you translate that? Do you translate as the having come into its into its activity, or as the constantly coming into its activity? That's a question that Heidegger takes up.
I guess I would just translate it as activity to avoid that problem. But
And if you avoid it, you plunge the thing into the dunkel that besets metaphysics. That's why we're looking for what's most originary here.
Not if Aristotle's right to say that activity is prior to motion.
Okay.
But that being set aside, the Aristotle bit, I think like I don't know. There are two questions I guess that I would press on that paragraph. The first one is when he says sagen wir, who is the wir? Who is we? And the second question I was ask is when he says in der Gegenstellung zum Werden zeigt es sich als die Ständigkeit, die ständige Anwesenheit. What is the status of this zeigt es sich als? Is it possible?
Can you remind me exactly where we are? Because I
96.
So
Niemeyer 96.
And which is this the paragraph unter der Voraussetzung? I don't see a sagen. Oh yes, I see.
We say, who's we? And then, what is the status of this zeigt es sich als? In other words, would it be possible that sein als Physis, namely the emerging, well, you don't want sway, you said governing, the emerging governing, could it be that this shows itself as presence, but is not really presence?
Yes, precisely. That's precisely it. I mean, surely the sagen wir simply is a way of saying in consequence of what went before. I mean, the wir is Heidegger, or rather, it's those who, or rather, what I mean by that is it's those who followed the argument so far and are in agreement with it. So given what has happened, and then you're right to draw us back to the distinction. So sein ist als Physis, das aufgehende Walten, and sein is not being, but this is because we are already involved in this being. And so we are already involved in this coming to presence. So there is a wir at work here, because it's the wir that is co-present to the presently present. I mean, in the same way that you and I are co-present together to this discussion, that's why there is a sagen wir in case. So we are in as much as we are in this presently present. It is as a presently present, the showing, physis, that which is seen, fueind, or that which is coming into the light, but it's because the sein leads. Das Aufgehende, as the emerging, it leads, it dictates, it shows. It's not that we show. So this is if we go back, take a step back, this is anti-Kantian, when there is no positing being done here. Physis is showing itself.
I agree with that.
And so, in as much as physis shows itself, it shows itself in its constant emerging, which constantly draws us towards it. The word that's missing here, but must be at work, is diseases, is Parmenides' word, questioning. It makes a demand on us, and inasmuch as it makes a demand on us, it opens us to questioning. It opens us to ask in what way and how. And inasmuch as we slide off from asking that, we simply take it for granted. Then we do some hiding, or rather, and that's where just a little further in section 49, we find that Heidegger is therefore trying to connect the notion of doxa, of that sliding off and relying on what is normally taken to be the case. as it were, rather than what is actually making a demand on us. In Heraclitus, I mean, that's the genius of the move, to connect doxa, Parmenides' notion, Parmenides' third way, Reinhardt's third way, after all. This is the caution with which he's moving with Heraclitus. That's a remarkable move. And that's the thrust of the argument here.
Well, it seems that what I was not suggesting that Heidegger's saying that we make it emerge or something like that.
No,
not
I
at all.
wasn't. So I didn't think you were for a minute. I mean, but that's what he has in mind in that assertion.
Well, I'm just not sure that Heidegger is endorsing this meaning of being here.
Right. Okay. Why not?
I think that he might be on board with Physis as emerging sway, but not as when it shows itself as Ständige Anwesenheit.
Why?
Because
does this not? No, I mean, it's not.
There are also the fact that he says that this is like the meaning of being for the Greeks, and so we can't just trace a line between that and what he thinks. That would be moving a bit too quickly for me, I suppose. But also because Ständige Anwesenheit is really the thing that he attacks throughout most of his work.
No, that's not right. He attacks other understandings of Ständige Anwesenheit, but he says continually that the Greeks understood being through Ständige Anwesenheit. So the attack on Plato is not that Plato is posits posits constant presence, but rather how Plato posits it. So it's not a question of, it's a question of different understandings of die Ständige. So that in this case, and this is why I think, that's why I think the Wir sagen is us, i.e. Heidegger. Because for Plato, Ständige Anwesenheit is an epikena, it's over there. It's beyond. It's not with respect, and that's why Heidegger says in die Platons Lehre von der Wahrheit, it's a meon. His notion of das Seiende is a meon, a non-being. But he wants this to be a genuine, das Seiende is a genuine interpretation of on, of being. And he says that in this text here. And so therefore, we have to locate where the Ständige Anwesenheit is. Now, the Ständige Anwesenheit, therefore, this is entirely consistent with an interpretation of Parmenides. The Ständige Anwesenheit cannot be a description of any particular thing. Rather, it must be that which makes possible everything. So that the constantly emerging as constant presence is what lets specificities of presence, i.e. the manifold. But it lets the specificities of presence in virtue of their unity, their Einheit. So the question is not whether or not we agree with Ständige Anwesenheit. And this is, I think, if I'm honest, and this is the mistake that Derrida made. Derrida assumed that in the phrase, the metaphysics of presence, both the word metaphysics and presence had to be abolished. But in fact, only one had to be abolished, metaphysics, so that we could then understand genuinely how presence came to presence. So presence comes to presence through the unmittelbar, the immediate, and not through the over there, the beyond. That would be my interpretation. And I can't see how you can Because my question would be, if what is in this paragraph is not really Heidegger, then why is it there? Well, it's normally there in Heidegger because he's naming somebody else who he's then going to pull apart. But in fact, this is entirely consistent with what we then find in section 49, which is the constant attempt to describe the Sammlung, the gathering, the gatheredness of the gathering, the Zusammen. Now, this is where I've found myself wanting at least to throw open the question of some of the translations that are made. The reason I want to throw open those questions, so for instance, to translate Zusammen as together, is not because I think that Greg and Richard made any mistake. They didn't. Zusammen does mean together. But in the way that Heidegger places Zusammen here, it means together as gathered. And so the primary indication of the Zusammen is the Sammeln of Zusammen. So that we have to hear it almost verbally as the togethering that lets individuality individuate, that lets the manifold unfold. I'll give you an example. If we turn to Nehemiah 97, in the translation, there is of the interpretation of fragment 1, where we begin to unfold the meaning of azunatoi. And he says here, in the English it says, laying out each thing kataphysin, according to being, and explicating how it behaves. But may I make a suggestion? The word that translates behaves is, if I didn't mark it up where I need to find it, is verhalt, verhielt, verhielt. But could I suggest an alternative here that lets the sense of this be better understood? And I would translate it like this, laying out each thing kataphysin, according to being, and explicating how being arranges. Because being arranges. Now, he says that later on. He says being sets things into rank ordering, rank, rang, he says. In other words, it's being that arranges. Now, what's being named here is Dike. In other words, the person, the ghost that stands behind this graph is Anaximander. Anaximander is also standing behind that word aufgehende, by the way. But this is Dike at work, sein aus Dike, as the arranging, setting into order that physis is in its emerging. And that's why it's an aufgehende, a constantly emerging, because in its emerging, it must arrange. It arranges what presence is for us, even though we who bring presence to light through aletheering, we name it, we speak it out in Legein. This is Larry's point. But we speak it out in its having been arranged. The speaking out does not do the arranging. It's again the contrast to Kant, the contrast to positing.
Is emerging a good translation of aufgehende?
Yes. I don't know if others disagree, but I mean, I would say so.
I think that's pretty much what we
Alf-
did in 32, wasn't it? In J35 was emerging and withdrawing was where we got to, I think.
Well, the aufgehen in German means immersed, absorbed. Heidegger uses that very often in Being and Time. And in fact, absorption is precisely the phenomenological pathway to getting past subject objectivity. Anyway,
I'm just looking.
I don't know if this idea of absorption
I'm
has
just
anything
looking at
to do with
The substantive das Aufgehen can mean absorption, yes, but when it's used as a participle like that, I would say it's not absorbed.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I mean, the first dictionary definition is to rise or to arise. To rise up, aufgehen, go up, upgoing.
Thank you.
He often translates Phusis as Aufgehen in GA78 as well.
I
Just
think
to
it's
touch on-
helpful,
Oh, sorry, no, carry on, David.
just briefly, that I think it's also helpful just to keep that notion of upward, up in mind as well. I mean, I'm thinking of other Heraclitus fragments, for instance, the way up and the way down is one and the same. And I think that the upward motion is often contrasted with the falling, say in being and time too.
If we look at that Nehemiah page 98, I mean, there is some very difficult language in this. We begins was entnehmen wir aus diesen beiden Bruchstücken? What do we glean from these two fragments? And then at the end of the third paragraph, we get this. We get die ständig in sich waltende, ursprünglich sammelnde Gesammeltheit, which the translation has the originally gathering gatheredness that constantly holds sway in itself. And what I would, again, I think this, if we need to see what's at work here, we need to, the translation really, or what the German really says is the constantly in itself prevailingly, we have to read this waltende almost like an adverb, prevailingly, original, gatheringly gatheredness. This is really hammering out the notion of the primordial unifying. And I've made a note to myself here. This is another word name for Zion. Now you'll notice in the text several times, instead of speaking of das Seiende, he speaks of Zion. Very often, Greg and Richard translate this as in being, but it actually works better if we translate it as when we're trying to get at the sense of it as just being, the activity of being, so that the activity of the presently being. This is not das Sein being, presency, but rather that which just is in its presentness is constantly itself prevailingly, originally, gatheringly gatheredness. Sorry, Aaron, you were going to say
No, I was just going to say ising.
Ising.
Because we're coming up against that in 78 a little bit, aren't we? We're not sure how to go about that.
So if we go a little further ahead to this page, this is just at the very bottom of Nehemiah 98, where we are really trying to explicate the meaning of logos. And so we have this paragraph which begins, dem Logos stehen die Menschen gegenüber, which the translation has human beings stand before Logos, but Heidegger puts Logos first. To the Logos stand men, or stand human beings, however you want to translate that. They stand over against it, gegenüber. It's not just a standing before. They stand over against it as those who do not grasp it. And he says this, and this is really crucial, I think, therefore. Human beings remain those who do not bring it together, who do not grasp it, who do not seize it as a unity. So that which offers itself as a unity, we are the ones who do not grasp it. Wir, there's your wir. we are the ones who failed to grasp its unity. And we're in as much as we do this, we are the ones who have not yet heard, and yet we have already heard. Now, if I looked for any proof text in Heidegger for why one should never translate Seiend or das Seiende as beings, it would be that one. Because here we have das Seiende, which is the gatheringly gathered unifying unity, which we as human beings fail to appreciate in its gatheredness. We are the ones who do not bring it to unity. So by calling it beings, we actually perform what we do to it in failing to be sufficiently addressed by its unity. Now, there is your proof text of why there can be a connection between what Heraclitus says with the Azunatoi and Parmenides with his doxa, with the commonly taken way of men and women in speaking when they speak of truth, of aletheia. So that this is why, as he goes on to say, top of page 99, human beings do not get through to Logos, even if they try to do so with words, epea. I mean, this is Heidegger, surely, with his tongue firmly in his cheek. He's now almost mocking the tradition. You know, you don't get through to the unifying, even when you've got the words to do it. So you think Logos is words, and that's what you're going to use to do it. But you can't get there with your words. This is Heidegger. This is what I call a Heideggerian joke. You know, it's one of those that takes 20 years of study to see.
I'm going to let Axel jump in, but I was just going to say it's quite easy to see why Heraclitus would be interpreted as metaphysically, isn't it? Because this could easily be interpreted as the Logos being over there, as the reason that stands above, or the epikeina over there. You know, that's how I'm guessing that's how he did it. But Axel, I think you were going to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to say something about this very passage because I just mentioned this to Lario just a few minutes ago, because in Poetry of Language Thought, in Wozu Dichter essay from 1946, if I'm not mistaken, Heidegger has this passage where he says, when we go to the well, when we go through the woods, we are always going through the word well, through the word woods, even if you do not speak the words and do not think of anything relating to language. I was curious whether this implies change in Heidegger's thought. What happened between in mid-30s and mid-40s? Is Heidegger changing his mind, or is Heidegger going back to where he started and being in time? The fact that we actually have access to phenomena through the very ordinary words with which we are familiar, or I'm just curious how you would interpret that.
The way I read it is that language is not just words. That is a function of literacy, where we see words with our eyes. The way that language incorporates itself into our being is, I think, something that has always been there for Heidegger. And so when he says, when you're walking through the woods, you're walking through the word woods, that is not literally the case, but the way in which words incorporate themselves into our understanding is never lost.
If we think of section 44 of Being and Time, which is the section where he describes how language itself uncovers the truth, does that not leave us with a lot of unanswered questions? And so my point would be this, that it seems to me that the working out of these sections here is precisely to try and answer those unanswered questions. I mean, it's a remarkable insight that he makes in section 44, but it's clumsy. It has lots of loose ends. I mean, one of those loose ends is how. How does this happen? Because he's unable to show at that stage what the connection is between the word and the thing uncovered. But here, in this understanding of logos, he is able to show how the more originary understanding of logos as the unitary gathering can then break out into the possibility of its being named in its truth. So that becomes clear. And so in other words, I don't think that later on there's any going back. I don't see an inconsistency with the later discussion in the 1950s and what is laid out here. Rather, it's the clarification. That's how I would put it that.
Can I ask Lawrence,
Well,
do you think?
just on that. Sorry, and then Larry, yes, but he says here, logos and legein already mean discourse and saying, and then he goes on to say, but this is not the essence of logos. In other words, he's positively asserting the connection. They do mean discourse and saying, but it's not the essence. The essence is the unifying gathering which lets the saying be said. But I apologize, Larry, for interrupting you.
I just want to ask you, do you think that belonging together and unifying mean the same thing?
Well, the zusammen, because yes, I do, because that's what he says here. At least that's how I read it. I mean, I don't think there's a constant effort here. So that again, the question is is not whether or not there are differences, but in what order they stand to each other. And so what is the more ursprünglich? What is the more originary? And so
well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I would be very happy to keep using the phrase belonging together and never use the word unifying.
But that preserves the manifold without seeking its unity. That would be my problem with that following this text. In other words, it's only because of the originary unity that the belonging together can be shown. And so therefore where we are searching out and down and through to the unity, but this isn't a back there unity. This is a unity which is immediately present to us.
Okay,
so that
I see what you
when he speaks of
I see
das
what
Sein
you're
im
saying.
Ganzen, when he speaks of das Sein im Ganzen, what he means is the whole field of being within which I also am, such that I then have to take myself out of das Sein im Ganzen, the presently present in its totality and unity and its finitude. So I take myself out as ein Seiendes, as that being which is concerned with this unity. It's again remaining within that totality, whilst also presencing within it as an individuality. So that we don't get in Hegel, we have this constant tension between particularity and universality. Now, again, in section 49, there is the most remarkable redescription of universality. So you'll remember, I think it was section 46 or 47. He says that the universal appears as a requirement in metaphysics. And then he says that the Zoonon is as it were, the unifying, which is not a universal, but nevertheless, it is a binding, and he calls it a Bändigung. Now, Bändigung is a really, really difficult word to interpret. And so Richard and Greg translated, and I think if I remember rightly, Aaron, it cropped up in the sections we've translated so far in GA 78.
Yeah.
So Bändigung can be translated as discipline. It can even be translated as subduing. But I'm absolutely convinced that what's being named here is the holding together. Bändigung means to be holding together. It's like a Bindung, but it's the constantly holding together, which is why it's a Bändigung rather than a Bindung, a simply bound up. And this must be Syneches. This is Parmenides' word Syneches. Syneches means holding with. Syn, together, echein, having with, in a holding together. So we normally translate this as the continuous. So that if one translates it as somehow a disciplining or a subordinating, you miss the point. But the xenon here is that which holds together for itself. The reference here again, I think, is to decay. And so the reference is also to Anaximander. We see once again that Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Parmenides are being made to speak from out of the same. This is the revolutionary move of these sections.
Just on that last point, just before we finish as well, Doug's point earlier about I'm not familiar with the Heidegger of the 50s yet, but this point on silence, and I'd plucked this passage out of GA78, which has a lot of relevance here, where he says the expression being itself, sein selber, emphasizes that being is conceived as itself. But what is it as itself? Nothing other than the connection. I've got it's Zusammenhang. I've got connection for now, but it's Zusammenhang that is conceived but unspoken, gesprochen. As this being, das Sein, unified in itself, is only the gathering, die Versammlung. The unity of the gathering is the self of being. So I think there's this connection here between the Heidegger of now and the Heidegger of the 50s, and this notion of the Ungesprochen as well. And I don't know if that relates to silence, but that's just what it reminded me of when Doug made mention of it.
I know you're anxious to close, Aaron, but just to answer one question in the chat that Yuchi raised. Did nobody before Heidegger point to logos as the most primordial etymology of gathering? In fact, he wasn't the first. There were others who raised this, and as Andrew pointed out, and Aaron, that there are others who he was in discussion with as well, who would give Legein as the more primordial meaning of Legein as gathering.
But to add to that, I don't think it's a naive question at all. I think it's the fundamental question. If you can answer that, then you understand Heidegger, I think.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for today. I was going to say next week we're doing, because we didn't get to 50s, we're going to do 50 and 51 next week. And then we've got a 2-week gap for Easter. And then another week, the week after that is going to, on April 10th, is going to be Lash's conference. So we've got next week, and then we're not back until April 17th.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.